This episode is brought to you by Trident Coffee, the veteran-owned brand where every sip inspires you to live life full steam ahead. At Trident, they are more than just coffee. They are storytellers. It's crafted by veterans. Their instant cold brew is perfect for those who serve, those who have served, and anyone who values wellness. Featuring natural ingredients like organic mushrooms, adaptogens, and nootropics, it's more than just a morning pick-me-up. It's your new wellness ritual. Enjoy it at home or on the go, wherever your day takes you. Trident Coffee isn't just about great-tasting coffee. It's about empowering you to be the healthiest version of yourself, because great veterans make great citizens. Try their instant cold brew coffee today and taste the freedom of wellness. Remember, when you choose Trident, you're not just choosing coffee. You're choosing a path of connection through health and wellness. Use promo code DTD15 for 15% off your order. Here we go. Going. In 3, 2, 1, and we're live. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the DTD podcast, Dynamic Tales Delivered. This week in the studio, a man that stands as a beacon of truth and inspiration, a multi-award-winning author, viral essayist, and seasoned graphic designer. His work transcends the ordinary, leaving an indelible mark on readers and audiences alike. His artwork and writing has been featured as the New York Times best-selling books and across prestigious platforms reflect a unique blend of creativity and depth. But he is more than just a creative force. He's a decorated combat veteran with tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he served under special operations. His bravery and dedication have earned him the Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and 2 Army Commendation Medals. His book, Where Cowards Go to Die, delves into the human condition, war, self-improvement, and faith, offering a voice of honesty and meticulous research in a world of yearning for better storytellers. His passion for storytelling is not just about sharing tales, but about connecting with the essence of what it means to be a human. Please welcome into the studio, Benjamin Sledge. What's going on, man?
That was a hell of an intro, man. I was like, golly, I wish I would have written that.
Yeah, that's you. So let's get right into it, man. There's so much that we have in common with each other. Yep. We both grew up in the same area. We both went to the same college. My daughter is now attending that college. So we are just, there's so much I have to talk to you about, because I think I understand some of your book just from where I come from a little bit more. I want to start out though. Yeah, I want to start out though. Growing up in Oklahoma, not the easiest place in the world to grow up in. It tries to be ahead of the time, or at least with the times, and sometimes that doesn't really work out for Oklahoma. I think you would agree with that. What I want to kind of drill down into though is you growing up, and your mom and your dad. They've been a force around in your life for a long time. But I want to kind of set the stage for everyone to understand exactly what kind of background you come from and exactly what kind of family that you come from. So let's start out just talking about your mom, and then we're going to move into your dad.
For sure. So my mom is, well, what's the best way to describe her? She's the matriarch of our family. And she runs the show. My dad is more the shy one, and we'll get to him. But she came from a very strong and opinionated family. My grandfather was a paratrooper in World War II. My grandmother just passed away at the age of 98 recently, and she was a firecracker. And so because of that, my mom has always kind of been that force in the house where my brother and I both developed kind of our, I would say, extroverted nature. Whereas my dad is just more of kind of a quiet, reserved guy who loved to just be in the medical field. And my mom was kind of the transient one, which is I took more after her side because she bounced around all over the United States while she was growing up. She was born in Wisconsin and then bounced over to upstate New York, and then she was out in California, and then to Colorado, and then to Oklahoma. So she was always kind of that force to be reckoned with, and I think I followed along in her footsteps for a while.
Well, with your father being who he was, I want to talk about your mom real quick. I want to point out a couple more things because you brought it up. Her grandfather, or I guess her father, your grandfather, was a paratrooper in World War II. but there's a little more to the story about him. Some stuff that he did in World War II. If we can talk about that, because I think it kind of sets the history. Now, what I will say about his military service and your military service is he didn't talk a lot about his. You have just decided to start talking about yours in the very recent past. You have started talking about it, but let's kind of talk about what he did and the special connections that he made in World War II.
Yeah, so my grandfather was a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne during World War II. He was in college around the time that the war broke out, and he was kind of a little bit later deferred, and he was doing ROTC, and then ended up at the University of Kansas and found out about this new paratrooper training program that they were putting people through. And he was like, yeah, I'll do that. I'll be infantry. I'll be airborne infantry. And signed up, went through, and then got deployed. So the crazy story about my grandfather, and I have a picture of him right here. He sits on my desk, but is that he missed the D-Day jump because he got pneumonia. And it was something that he never really ever brought up. He brought it up to me once because I think it was like after Saving Private Ryan kind of came out, and I had some questions. I was still in high school, still, it was right before I joined the military. And he caught pneumonia, was hospitalized, missed the D-Day jump, and then got transferred over to Patton's Third ID over in Germany. So when he got transferred after he took leave in Paris, and I still have like his Paris leave pamphlet, his airborne paratrooper training where he kept his notes and everything. It's just this like time capsule of history that's amazing to me. He became General Patton's Scotch supplier. Now, this is the craziest part. Everyone's like, how the hell did that happen? Him and another lieutenant, being dumb butter bars that they were, decided that it would be really awesome if they hijacked a mortuary affairs vehicle, because back then it's, you could stack multiple bodies in the just kind of those trucks and fill it to the brim with Johnny Walker Red. And so they go out into town, they fill this mortuary affairs vehicle up, they head back to the O Club, the officers club, and they are heroes there. Heroes. Everybody loves them because they've got the good booze. And so my grandfather says he's sitting at the table, and he's like, we're getting a little schnockered, because that's the word that he used. He's like, we're getting schnockered. And he said, the door opens, because it's dark in where they're at. And he just hears, say, boys, where can I get some of that fine Johnny Walker Red? And he says, well, that depends on who you are. And he says, all of a sudden, all the men at the table just stand to attention. And he just turns kind of a little tipsy, and Patton's nickel-plated revolver is, right at his eye line on his hip. And so he stands up, he goes to attention. My grandfather's Johnny on the spot. He was always a quick-witted man. And so he wanted to provide MWR, morale, welfare, and recreation for his troops. So he ends up telling Patton, hey, if you'll give me some tennis rackets, I'll trade you a case of scotch. And so the trade goes through, everything's great. My grandfather forgets you need tennis balls to play tennis, because there were these tennis courts where they had taken over in Germany. And so he's like, oh my God, everybody's going to hate me. What do I do? So he calls up Patton's office, and Patton's secretary answers, and she's like, General Patton. And he's like, I need to talk to the general. And he's like, I'm a lowly lieutenant. He was like calling up the general of, the U.S. Armed Forces. And he was like, there's no way this call is going through. And of course, the secretary asks, well, who's calling? And he realizes it's not going to go through unless he thinks of something quick. And so he goes, tell him it's a scotch supplier. And he said the call goes straight through. And he said for another case of Johnny Walker Red, he said he got a can of tennis balls, and he said they played until the felt came off those things. So my grandfather has this very intense history. And when I got deployed, I was with 82nd Airborne as well, too, with 3504th Blue Devils before they disbanded. And that's a combat patch I'm authorized to wear, and one of the ones that I'm most proud of because, my grandfather and I both get to wear the same combat patch, which means a lot to me. And then at the same time, my grandmother, her dad was a World War I veteran who fought in like trench warfare, and I think he just kind of succumbed to the injuries that he sustained during World War I and died shortly when she was very young And then her mom died rapidly after that, and she went to live with her grandmother during the Great Depression. But she was the one who actually compiled a lot of the history on my mom's side, and found out that, we came from like the Scots-Irish side of things, but also the French. And like in all of our lineage, there was always somebody serving in military service on my mom's side. And it dated all the way back to a general under Napoleon Bonaparte, which I thought was pretty crazy. But my dad's side is probably the side that everybody recognizes and everybody knows because of my last name.
Well, I want to go into your father because I think that's an important thing. One last question that I have, though, about your mom's side of the family. Did that really drive you into a military service? Did that really, knowing those stories and stuff, did that really set it into kind of motion for you? Because a lot of people will hear it and they kind of fantasize about being in the military and stuff. But do you think that that was one of the main driving forces in what you did?
Oh, absolutely. My grandfather was the driving force behind why my brother and I both joined the Army, because I had kind of entertained the Marines for a little while. My parents didn't like that, and they were like, no way, why do you want to be a jarhead, kind of thing. And then my grandfather, after talking with him, he was like, why don't you join the Army, follow in the family footsteps. And he was there at my graduation from basic training. They put him in the reviewing stand because they were just absolutely blown away, because he was a World War II vet and he still had his ID. So he showed that, and they just put him in the reviewing stand, like next to the colonel, and they're like, we got the greatest generation right here with us, So he really was. He influenced both me and my brother, and I would say he was the biggest force for that. And then, my other grandfather served in the Army as well too. So it was just a very long lineage. And, we like to joke that it runs in the blood, and I think it does, because both my uncles, his sons, were in the Army as well too. And then once you get over to my dad's side, everybody was in the Army as well.
Well, I want to put a pin in that huge lineage of the military, because I think it's going to come into play a little later on. But we've built up this a little bit. Let's talk about your dad. And what was interesting about your dad to me was he kind of wasn't afraid to be who he was and to live out kind of the ideals that he wanted to live out. And we should set the stage that your father was an AIDS nurse at the very kind of beginning of the blooming of the AIDS outbreak. Beginning. Yeah. And when it was very taboo, no one really knew anything about it. There was a lot of myths that were going on about it. And your father took a stand and said that those people needed help that had this, and that he was going to stand by and do what he was trained to do. And I want to kind of understand how that played off on you, because it's not a military thing, but it's definitely someone that's standing up for a very honorable cause and doing the right thing, even when it might not agree with everyone around you.
Yeah. My dad wanted to be in the military. He tried to join the Air Force during Vietnam and was disbarred because he had asthma as a kid growing up. And but he took on the kind of nurse profession. And you got to remember, like, everybody now, it's like, nurse, what's the big deal? Back in the 80s, that was not something that a lot of the guys had. Like, if you remember the movie Meet the Parents, like Robert De Niro, the whole movie is making fun of Ben Stiller for being a nurse, and now it's like totally normal, totally acceptable. But back then it really wasn't. And so my dad had wanted to enter. He didn't want to be a doctor. He wanted to have a specialty and work with kind of like people that were high risk and needed help. So, he worked in the ICU, which is intensive care units, and was kind of a trailblazer for his time to do that. And so he had this quiet professionalism to him, to where he would take stands, even though he's a very quiet man. Like, he would do it even against my grandfather, because my grandfather could get cantankerous on my mom's side, and they would just have these big old family arguments. And they would ask him what he would think, and he would just drop a one-liner and shut everything down. So he was always good about standing for something. But when the AIDS, HIV epidemic broke out, they needed people. And one of his best friends was running basically kind of this like clinic on a tract of land that was like double wide trailers, because hospitals just didn't have the room. They didn't know what was going on. And so my dad was inspired by his friend who was taking care of predominantly drug addicts and homosexuals at the time. And, my dad and my mom met in Bible college in Oklahoma. And so we were all attending this very conservative church. And so when people found out that my dad was treating drug addicts and then gay and lesbians, like they just freaked out. And a lot of people didn't know that like HIV/AIDS wasn't airborne at the time. There was a lot of misinformation around it. People thought you could get it from hugging or from kissing or getting a kiss from somebody, and so they assumed that he had contracted that. And so therefore, eventually, like people wouldn't sit next to us at church. It got bad enough to the point to where a couple of their friends were like going to take a vote as to see whether they could even stay friends with my parents. And my dad, being kind of the leader that he was, he really wanted my mom to see what it was like. And so he started having her go to the clinics where, a lot of them were dying. And so she befriended a lot of them. And even held hands with some as they died, met their partners, met, their husbands and wives from the drug addicts and stuff. So they really kind of set the stage for me to understand this is what empathy and compassion kind of look like. And so I'd always operated in that manner, but growing up, it's kind of difficult when you're in that environment because of the fact that you just kind of become a social outcast and a pariah because of what your family does. So we were instructed, my brother and I both, to not tell anyone what my dad did. We just said he was a nurse, that he worked in a hospital. We didn't tell them what wing. When they asked, we would just say we don't know, and kind of left it at that because it was wildly unpopular.
Well, I want to point this out too, that when you talk about your father and you talk about the church, it wasn't just a thing where you guys kind of went to church. Church was a huge part of your life, and your family's life, to point that out. And I think that's your first disillusionment with the church, was when you saw stuff like this happen. Now, I would like to point out that I think that you could make any story sad. It doesn't matter what story it is. I think you could flip it on its head and make it sad. You talk about church camp, going to there, and how much that you like going there, but then it turns into a bad thing because you're an outcast, because you're a metalhead, and because you won't burn your CDs. Yeah. And then you come back and you don't fit in, and you can't quite figure out that place. But I wonder, with the church and them turning their back on you, and at least from your eyes seeing it then, what did that put in the future for you? Because I think that your faith has been tested a bunch of times, and you've kind of been almost like, I'll point out later on, like an alcoholic. You've been on and off the wagon a lot of times with it. So can we talk about how you see that as a kid and how it kind of shapes your thoughts going and getting older and kind of stepping away from that?
Yeah. I think everybody has to go through their own faith journey in life. And for me, war definitely kind of brought out the spiritual aspect of things where I had to start wrestling with that. But that's later in the story. But early on, Oklahoma, as you know, is kind of like the buckle of the Bible Belt. There's like a church on every corner. It's a very conservative state, and out of that, they unfortunately mixed a lot of political ideology in with the church, which, me personally and what I believe and what I've read of the life of Jesus doesn't seem to mesh really well. So out of that, there was a lot of dogma that was associated. So my upbringing was a lot like Footloose in the church, like the 1980s Kevin Bacon one, not that new abomination that they just put out. Like it was like, hey man, like don't drink, don't do drugs, don't have premarital sex, and like you and God will be cool and just be a good person, and that's that. And you have to remember too, like in the 80s, like church was this big thing where, in order to be seen as a respectable, upstanding business leader or whatever, you determine like where you went to church and stuff. So it was in every aspect of my life, and I think for a lot of people it was more of a kind of a cultural thing to do, and I still think that to be the case for a lot of people. Like it's like, oh, I'm a Christian because my dad was a Christian or my mom was a Christian or I grew up in Texas, whatever that means. And so, which is, and I make this point a lot. That's a really stupid hobby to have. Like you could be doing so much more cool stuff with your time if you really like if it's just this nominal like whatever it's not going to impact my life, then why bother, And so I think I got to that point just being ostracized because I was the metalhead. Like I got introduced to rock and roll at first. I remember this. I don't write about this in my book, but I remember the day I became a metalhead. It was the middle of I think it was late 80s. And I remember I was sitting on my neighbor's driveway and we had a boombox out because everybody had a boombox. And, Welcome to the Jungle, I think. It was a Guns N' Roses song. It was one of those. It was Guns N' Roses. And I was like, this is awesome. I have got to find more music like that. And that led, down that road to where all of a sudden I'm getting introduced to Metallica and Megadeth and Anthrax and Slayer and Pantera and Sepultura. And, by the time I'm in high school, I still remember the first time I heard the Black Album and I was like, I only want to listen to music like this forever. and then with the rise of grunge music as well too, and Nirvana and Soundgarden and the Smashing Pumpkins, that stuff was just not acceptable in any form in the Christian church. And so because of that, there was like at church camps a lot of times these big old bonfires where they're like, everybody burn your secular music. It didn't matter if it was like Tim McGraw or Garth Brooks or Metallica, but you were really evil if you were listening to Metallica. So, and I wouldn't do it because I thought it was stupid. And so that's going to further separate you because I'm already the goth kid with long hair down to his shoulders. I'm wearing my Jinko jeans and my band t-shirts. And yeah, you remember that. You remember that lifestyle. You know what's up.
What, do you shop at Gadzooks? I think that's what it's called.
Yes, Gadzooks. And Goodwill, if you were wanting to find some thrifty stuff, it was dope. But yeah, Gadzooks was a big one. And then like, what was that? Pac Sun, I think was one. I don't know. Gadzooks was the big one though. Inside, I think
Woodland Hills.
Woodland Hills Mall. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Listen though, I think we need to be serious though about when you say that those were the things to stay away from, that music, no premarital sex, no alcohol, no smoking.
Yeah.
You kind of broke all of them. You wanted to hang out with your friends and drink beer. But I'm really wondering, you talk about it a little in the book, but I'd like to hear it from you. That seems that it would offset you with your parents even more than you kind of pointed out in the book. So can you say how you kind of managed that? Because I like I said, you talk about it a little in the book, but it doesn't go into a lot of detail of how you navigate that minefield.
Okay. So I joke about this now with my mom. I was like, I would kill to be an 80s parent. You want to know why? Here's why, and I'm sure you remember this. They just didn't care what you did or where you were half the time. There's literally, for the young people listening to this, there was literally a public service announcement that they would play, and I know you remember this, and it
10 o'clock.
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? They had to remind parents that they freaking had children. I'm like, and literally, so like I lived outside, and as a kid, but by the time that I was a teenager, and I had all these other friends and we were all like, we're like, yeah, we're Christians or whatever. We were literally just all hanging out. We all had trucks. We would go out to the woods. Like everybody would go out to the woods. We'd all get beer. Like we were drinking Budweiser and we'd have these bonfires in the woods and we would just all party together. And I literally lived, I think every weekend, not at home. I was always over at my buddy's house. We were all like, because his parents were like constantly gone. And we had figured out that there was this spot in his bathroom that we could remove above his cabinet and just like funnel like a 30 pack in there and it would just stay warm. And then this is how just dumb and naive we were. We literally crack those beers and then pour them over ice and then drive around in the woods with them until like the rest of the stuff in the cooler got cold. were smoking pot. Like it was one of those moments where I think because parents were like largely aloof and things were a little bit more riskier for, teenagers then versus like, Gen Z where they're kind of more risk averse, then that I think it was just really easy to hide it all from them and just them not have a clue because I'm not waking up hungover at their house. I'm not coming home and they're like, oh, let me smell your breath kind of thing. So I think in that respect, like everybody had like that friend that you would hang out with, or you would like hop houses every weekend, and I was just gone. So it wasn't that big of a deal. I think I just don't think that they knew.
So how does that work out for you in like school and having a job and being at least a little mature as you hit your teenage years?
Yeah, I was high functioning. So like my parents, my mom, just I'm 43 now, and she calls me the other day and she's like, "I am so sorry," and I was like, "For what?" She was like, "That made you and your brother think that B's were unacceptable." So like growing up, my brother and I could really only have straight A's. Like that was the standard in my home. And so I knew that if I started dropping those standards, then they would know something was up. So I kept up the facade. Like I would study really hard. I would work really hard at the same time too. I got a job and I would work in the evenings at like kind of this warehouse facility and do that. So I had money for gas and Burger King and all the dumb stuff and the beer. But aside from that, I was very high functioning, and I think when you're young, you can be now. Like, I mean, you drink a couple beers in your 40s now, you feel like you get hit by a Mack truck sometimes. So.
Well, so here's my question to it though. You're very high functioning. You do okay in school and stuff, but I want to kind of talk about what you just said, where you kind of keep up a facade. I want to use a different term for it, because I think you've done it a couple times throughout your life, at least in the book, is where you put on a mask. And you're a person that either you need to be or you don't want to be. And so I want to kind of ask you about when you're at that age and you're not fitting in anywhere, and you've got this group of friends where you drink. So I guess you're fitting in with them, but in society in general, until you get later on in high school, you're not really fitting in. Is this the first time that you think you started being something either that you didn't want to be or that you were scared to be?
Yeah, I really do. I feel now that all my identities have reconciled into like who I really am. But when you're young, a lot of times you're trying to figure out who you are. And so when it started for me, I was this sweet kid who really liked art. And I sang in choir in elementary school. And then by the time that I got to middle school, I realized like that's not really acceptable, because I was like, oh, I want to be in band and I'm going to play the saxophone because Kenny G is dope and he probably gets the ladies. And I was so wrong. And so I left the saxophone, and then I started hanging out with a group that really loved metal. And they were the goths and the ravers and the stoners. And so by proxy, I was just considered, the bad kid. And out of that, I kind of stepped into that identity, but it was really more for me. If I could pull back what I really wanted, it was like, I loved metal. I loved like wearing black clothes and stuff like that, and the fashion that way. And it wasn't popular, it didn't get popular until, like, I laugh at all the emo kids now because I'm like, you don't know what it was like to be emo back in the day. Do you know what it was like? Everybody was ripping on you. They were shoving you into lockers. They were calling you, they were calling me the art fag and like all this other stuff. And so eventually what I did is I realized like, okay, I am apparently unacceptable to the people around me. So I have to change who I am to become somebody that's more palatable for people to succeed in life. Because again, I was high functioning. And so literally overnight, I cut off all my hair, and I went to my mom and I said, here's the deal. I'll cut off my hair, but I got to get blonde tips like Mark McGrath from Sugar Ray, because that dude gets chicks.
Oh my God.
Yeah, man. I mean, I was fickle. I was superficial. And so I did, and it was this really weird transition period. I still have photos of this. I looked back at them the other day because we were talking about it. But I started shopping at like Abercrombie and Fitch, but I didn't know like my style because like that's what everybody else was wearing. You know, it was like Hollister and Abercrombie and Fitch, and I was still wearing like Jinko jeans with like Abercrombie tops, and it just didn't mesh. It was weird. And so eventually I had to like phase everything out. And then I started getting invited to parties and with the, you know, kind of more popular crowd. And I realized it was really superficial and I didn't want to become that person because I really didn't like that crowd. And then eventually I met a group of friends that I'm still friends with today that have been my friends since high school. We ended up doing college together that were really kind of more of the outcasts too, but they were kind of preppy, but also at the same time, they liked metal. They liked going to shows. They liked to party. And so we all just kind of hit it off. And then eventually I think the identity for me that I was like, I got to impress people and I got to do something with my life because everybody else was talking about, they're like, oh, I'm going to go to college, you know, in high school, you know, it's like, oh, I'm going to become a veterinarian or whatever. And I was like, well, I'm going to be badass and I'm going to join the military and then forget everybody else. I'll be the cool guy. And that was, you know, that was 1999, man. That was peacetime army under Bill Clinton. The last conflict we'd really had was Bosnia-Herzegovina. And even then it was just kind of more peacekeeping stuff. And prior to that, it was just the Moog, you know, Mogadishu. And that was like a one-day event. So I went in with the idea thinking I'll be a military. My identity was like, I'll be the military guy and I'll be the college guy and I'll be super cool. And then people will like me. And so that's really where I kind of constantly was I was like a chameleon. I was constantly changing colors to blend into whatever surrounding that I needed to be in.
So let me ask you though, 2 questions to that. First off, you said you would kind of do whatever it took for people to like you. Looking back on it now, did you even like yourself?
No. Oh no, I hated myself.
Did you know that then? I mean, like if you look back on it now, did you have any idea that you really didn't like yourself or who you were becoming or anything like that? And the reason I ask that is because there's a time in the book when you're overseas that I think that same thing happens again where you start to see yourself change. Back then, did you see it at all or are you oblivious to it?
I was oblivious. I didn't even really figure it out until I was in my 30s and I was doing counseling, you know. There was 2 moments that really stood out. Like my best friend, he got into 12-step for self-hate. And I was like, oh, I thought that was for like drugs and alcohol. He's like, no, you can go through it for everything. And so I was like, man, maybe this would help me with what I've dealt with overseas and why I can't seem to like myself and reconcile my identities and stuff like that. So this is in my early 30s. That when I went through that program, it was really, really powerful to see that like the core of my issue was that I just didn't like myself. I hated who I was. And then another time was my wife and I, we did this marriage boot camp and like you had to do this like experiments where you like get in touch with like your inner child. It all sounds really stupid when you say it out loud, but I realized the person who I was, I had locked the person who I really was in like this cage. And there was still this like scared kid that was there that I thought that nobody would really like if they got to know me. And I think that's the temptation now still too, is that if I talk about like what I did and what I saw overseas, or if I'm really honest about, you know, what happened or who I am, then people are not going to like me. And truth be told, that's just going to be life. But the temptation is to play it safe still and to take that coward's way out. And so, yeah.
Well, so that would be my next question, but I think you pretty much answered it. Was when you look back on that, do you regret that? But it doesn't seem like you do. If you still are trying to play it safe at the age that you are now, do you regret being that chameleon?
No. So I don't know if you've seen the new Deadpool and Wolverine movie.
I have not seen it yet.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to ruin it, and I don't want to ruin it for your read. but basically at the end, you know, Wolverine is trying to fix stuff from his timeline. And, you know, he was kind of a crappy person. And they said, there's nothing to fix. They said, you would not have been able to do what you did without having the past that you did. And I think that's the same is true for me too now. It's like I can look back and go, yeah, that sucked. But I can also look back on it and be grateful. And I think that's the truth of everything. When you endure suffering and hardship and you are able to grow from that and see and learn from your past, it shapes and forms the identity, a better identity of who you can be, because you're able to reconcile all those elements. So yeah, I didn't know or care at the time. And now it's something that I'm grateful for, that I've been through, so that I can be the person that I am today.
Okay, so let's talk about going further with that. While you're in college and you join the military,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like even though that was your idea to be the cool guy, be in the military, be in college, once you signed on the dotted line, you weren't quite sure that that's what you wanted to do anymore. And the reason I say that is because I feel like from reading the book, you were a little conflicted with it. And I'll point out a time of whenever you're on spring break and you're watching the invasion happen and you're partying, and then all of a sudden you stop and you're, well, I should be with the guys. Well, I should do this. I'm letting my unit down and stuff. But you're not really in a huge hurry to make that difference. So can we talk about kind of the internal conflicts that are going on with you? Because I think there was a piece of you that wanted to be there, but I think there was also the piece of you that kind of liked being in college and being the cool guy and going to the frat parties and drinking and stuff.
That's honestly what I wanted to do. I wanted to have my cake and eat it too. Like I wanted to be like, yeah, look at me, I'm this hero kind of thing. Look at me in the military. We're all going over to Afghanistan and Iraq, so you guys aren't, ha 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 ha. But I was really afraid. Like I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay in college and just, you know, enjoy my life and kind of play soldier on the side in the reserves. And that was not going to happen. So yeah, in reality, I wanted to play it safe. I always wanted to play it safe. That was the, like, kind of the coward way for me, was to always play things safe to where I looked good because it was very image oriented because of my past. And then at the same time, you know, kind of have the notoriety because of the military. And again, this is all selfish. It sounds superficial and stupid because it is. But yeah, I even, when we first started the deployment process, I was figuring out ways in my head to get out of that deployment because I wanted to stay in college.
So it's a shallow victory, though. Let's say you get out of the deployment, okay? Let's say you get to stay in college. It's a shallow victory that you stayed away, because I feel with everything that you've said in your book, you're going to start to regret that decision a little bit into it. Mm-hmm. So have you ever sat down and thought about why you didn't want to do it? Were you scared? Because of course you talk about being scared and all of those things of going over there, but I wonder more if you're scared about losing that lifestyle or scared about what's going to happen over there.
I was scared about what was happening over there. I was afraid I was going to die. Like, you know, and the war was so new, and the reports that were coming out, you know, I was looking at stuff like Operation Anaconda had happened. And I was like, oh no, like, is this what we're, and here's the thing, like a lot of people just don't know until they know. The reality of war is that, like, a lot of people don't see combat. Like there's a lot of force multipliers that ensure that you're eating well, that your mail's delivered. There's quartermasters, there's military police that sit on base and never have to deal with anything. But my assumption was, because we hadn't been in a war since really Vietnam, that once you're in a war, like, people die, and that's the truth. People do die. I didn't know that I was going to be on the front lines until I discovered I was going to be on the front lines, and that was really scary for me and really changed my perspective. And so that was the moment when I realized, like, oh no, like, I am in trouble here. and I can stay safe if I take like a headquarters job or do something like that. But yeah, when I got those orders, I was just full of piss and vinegar, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna be awesome. And then as the reality set in, I started to get really scared.
How long do you think it took for the reality to set in?
Probably like once I got to Fort Bragg. Um, yeah, like all the pre-mobilization stuff I was fine with, and I was like, it'll be fine. And I was kind of delusional, honestly, too. I was still trying to, I talk about this in my book. I was like planning frat parties while I was doing, mount operations.
Well, that's how you got your nickname.
Yeah, Hollywood. Yeah, because I was a jackass. Like, and it's funny now, like my team sergeant, he doesn't call me that anymore. Nobody called me that after I did a few things in combat that, I guess they respected. But yeah, for a long time, I was that idiot. I was for the listeners, I was trying to plan a frat party, and my fraternity brothers had called me while we were doing mount operations, which is military operations in urban terrain. And so they had like role players and everything, like people that were speaking Arabic. There's like some special forces guys out there and everything. They're trying to get us all prepped. And I am like sneak off into like one of these, concrete buildings and take a phone call from my fraternity brothers so they can figure out how to make this like liquor infused, like trash can punch ridiculousness. And my team sergeant walks in and he can't believe, like, I mean, there's like simunition going off and explosions and crazy stuff. And I got my finger jammed in my ear and I'm yelling on the phone, old flip phones that we all had back in, the early 2000s, telling him how to make this stupid drink. And he looks at me, and from across the room, I just tell he's pissed. And I start like hurrying up on the instructions. And he just says, "Hey, Hollywood, get off the fucking phone, man." And that was it. The name stuck. I was Hollywood. I was the jackass from infinity and to beyond. And once the story spread, everyone called me it.
Well, do you think that you trained hard enough? Do you think you took it seriously enough? Because you were worried about dying over there, but it doesn't sound like you were taking training very seriously.
I wasn't initially. Yeah. I think once I sat down with Paul Gonzalez, who was my team sergeant, initially where he's like, you got to do better. This is before we had our kind of, heart to heart, where he just took more of the gruff sergeant and was like, look, you got to get your shit together. You're an E4, like what is, unacceptable. And so I started playing the game better, and taking training seriously. I was doing the ruck marches. I was doing all the I was learning, we even got gassed before we went, which was weird. I went back through the gas chamber a couple times. But overall, I started taking the training seriously because I was like, well, if something happens, I should probably know what I'm doing. And I was always fit too. So I could hump long distances and I was always going to the gym because I was a meathead. So I wasn't worried about the physical aspect, and I was taking the training seriously with, the 203s and our M16s and everything else, and the Mark 19s and the saws. That I knew that I needed to qualify on and do well enough just in case, shit hit the fan. But I was still just really scared. So I kind of did and I kind of didn't. Like my whole goal was like, I'll train hard so that way we can party in the evenings, and I can take my mind off this, and I'll drink myself stupid before I go to bed.
Okay, so let's talk about when you get over there. You touch wheels on the ground and it's real.
It's real.
What's going through your mind?
I'm going to die. So,
I mean, is that the only thing you're thinking, or are you trying to kind of put this together and piece some kind of a plan together?
I am. So the plan is, so initially we got this briefing that we all joke. We still to this day call it the "You're all going to die" brief, where we had one of the guys from the special forces teams that we were going to replace out in some of the areas. because I was a civil affairs guy who was originally under the United States Special Operations Command, and since then they've moved certain sections directly underneath that command and the rest out. So we were training with all the cool guys, and I get there, and there was this star on a map where it just had a bunch of explosions around it out near the border. And my team sergeant, Paul Gonzalez, he's like, "Hey, what's that place?" And this special forces team sergeant is like, "Oh, that you don't want to go there. That's where everybody gets blown up and shot to shit." And he was like, "That's exactly where I want to go." And that's when it really freaked me out. I was like, and then the civil affairs team that we were replacing, dude, it was just some of their stories were really brutal. Like this one guy, I'll never forget it. I was just trying to connect with him a little bit. It was, while we were doing a RIPTOA, the relief in place, transfer of authority. And I just asked him, he was a reservist and he'd gotten activated. And I said, "What do you do back home, man?" And he said, "I'm a school teacher." And I was like, "All right, cool." I was like, "So like, what's the craziest, worst thing that you've seen out here?" And he proceeds to tell me this story where I was just like, "Oh my God." So they had come under fire, and they called it, like one of the ETACs called in this airstrike, and they hit the wrong target, and they like killed a bunch of kids. And he said, "I had to dig those bodies out of the rubble." And he said, "Some of them are probably the same age as some of my kids back home in my classroom, and hand them back to their parents. And then I had to pay them and say, I'm sorry that we killed their kids." And I was like, and at that moment I was like, shit's real. This is not good. So the way that civil affairs teams work is you're either in a civil affairs team Alpha, which is like the operational detachment Alpha for the Green Berets, or you're in a civil affairs team Bravo, which is kind of more support element, more headquarters. And I was like, I need to get transferred over to like one of these, like stay behind a desk, like let's run some PowerPoints, never do nothing. That's what I need to do. And so I started making like kind of subversive comments and, putting my feelers out, seeing if anybody wanted to trade with me. But I had been training with my team the whole time, and you really don't want to have that happen at the last minute. And Paul got wind of it, and he took me out to this area. And so when we first went into Afghanistan, this is 2003, you have to remember the Rangers jumped into Kandahar in 2002. And so not really much had changed within, the span of like 9 months from that time period. So there was this area called Taliban Last Stand, which is where your mail and other stuff was. And there's just bullet holes through the building. And then the first day that I get there, we uncover a mine, because Afghanistan's like one of the most on base, literally on base. We're like walking and we're like, oh, this is a mine. And they had to cordon off the area, and it was right near where we were going to be living. Where our team who was staying in Kandahar was going to be living. And so a lot of the trash and rubble and like twisted metal, they had pushed over to this one area, and there was somebody had built like this round rotunda building and spray painted Thunderdome on the top. And like, that's where guys that had beef with one another would just go in there and beat the shit out of each other, and everybody would watch, make sure that they didn't kill one another. And so all of a sudden there's a couple picnic tables by this. Paul's like, "Hey man, walk with me." And I'm like, and he takes me over near Thunderdome, and I'm like, I'm about to get, the shit kicked out of me. He has me sit on the bench, and he goes, "Hey man, I heard you asked to stay behind in headquarters." And I was like, couldn't even look at him, and I'm scratching the table, picking splinters and stuff. And he lets out this big sigh. And then finally he's like, takes this like dad voice with me, and he's like, "Hollywood, look, I know you're scared." And he said, "I'm scared too." And like all of a sudden I look up at him, and he's looking at me and he's like, he's like, I know where we're going. And he said, I worry about leaving my wife a widow and my daughter having never known her father, because his daughter was, an infant when we left. And he said, but here's the deal. We've trained together. We know each other. I know you got my back. I've got yours. And he said, tomorrow we're all going to get on that chopper. And he said, we'll all be scared together, but we're all going to make it through this. And I believe in you, and I know you can do good. And so he just kind of stands up, squeezes my shoulder, and just kind of leaves me there to think for a while. And I probably sat there for a good 30 or 45 minutes. And then I got up, and he gave me the courage and the fortitude to do the right thing. Because he also just looked at me and he said, look, he said, Hollywood, courage is doing the right thing even when you're afraid. So I took that to heart, and I was like, all right, I'm going to do the right thing. I don't know how this is going to work out, but I'm going to get on that chopper with my team, and I'm going to go, and we'll see how this all turns out. And so I really kind of put myself into the unknown. And the next day we were on a helicopter zipping through valleys, and they're like shooting the sides of them while we were going there doing clear by fire. And I'm like, this is nuts. And then we landed Organy Fire Base, which is out on the border of Pakistan.
When you get out there, I want you to describe who you were as a person. Like when you look at yourself hard and you go, this is who I am. And what I mean is, are you compassionate? Are you caring? Do you believe in the mission fully? Do you believe in helping these people? Do you believe in liberating? All of those kind of things. What is it, how you would describe yourself when you get to that fire base?
When you first get there, you kind of believe in the mission. Like you do. And I did. I was like, and we're young and naive. And everybody was young and naive. Everybody was still mad about 9/11. Like we remember like what had happened. The towers fell. That was fresh. Everyone was still pissed. So it's like, we're going to take these backward ass people and we're going to bring democracy and blah, blah, blah. And that's what you're thinking. And you're like, oh, they don't let girls have an education. We're going to give them an education, and how dare they? And the Taliban are evil and all this other stuff. And then you kind of realize like the way that we think in America is not the way that they think or their culture. And a lot of them didn't care. They didn't want our way of life. And that was the fallacy of the American hubris, was that we thought everybody wants to be like us. And the reality of the situation was they just wanted to be left alone. They didn't give a rip. They were just willing to talk and inform on whoever gave them the most money. And so they would turn on their aunts. It's funny. We'd roll into like a village, and sometimes we'd be out with like some of the special activity guys or the secret squirrels, the guys that are all like tier 1 operators. And they'd have backpacks full of cash, and we had our backpacks full of cash for like, reconstruction efforts and different things of that nature. And they'd come through a village and they'd be like, all right, where's the Taliban at? And like suddenly everybody wants to sell out their least favorite uncle for like $5. And I begin to see while I was there, because my job was to be, the cultural affairs expert, to understand the history, the demography, the background, the occasion, what has happened here since the time of Alexander the Great. And I realized like, we've got the mission all backwards here. Like we're trying to do things that we think they want, that they don't really want. And like we would build girls' schools and they'd blow them up. Like they'd come through and blow them up. They're like, women don't need an education. And then it just led to a lot of, us fighting in the mountains against either the Taliban or Al Qaeda, because they could just run across the border and back and forth. And so initially it's like, I wanted to believe in the Afghan people, but as I begin to see their culture, I begin to, and I'm not saying that this is right at all. I'm telling you what my experience was at the time. I begin to see their culture as the enemy. And so I was like, oh, they're an enemy to everything that we stand for freedom, for democracy, all this other stuff. They're so backwards. And so I begin to become very callous towards them. And I was like, okay, well, we can do the reconstruction efforts and all this. And I was always great to a degree with the kids. Sometimes I would play mean tricks, obviously, because I began to view even them as the enemy. And I think the reason why was when your friends start dying, and when people start dying that you've served with, suddenly the only thing that matters are the people next to you and everything around you. And it's a very calloused way, but if you're in those environments long enough, you can become calloused enough to where you begin to view everyone that is not on the side of an American as an enemy. And luckily that changed for me by the time that I got to Iraq. But Afghanistan was that first iteration for me to where, I developed a thick, callous skin where empathy and compassion went out the window. Like all the things that we talked about earlier about my dad, wanting to help people and then their Christian background. I took on this really nihilistic tone in my life where I was like, I don't know what we're doing here. I don't even know what I'm doing. The human beings, we just seem really good at wounding and killing each other. So why does anything that we do matter? And so I built this thick armor around me to where I was like, I'm just not going to worry. I'm going to do my job. We're going to take out bad guys and I'm going to go home. And that was literally my single focus. And I think to a degree, it really kept me alive during that time period, because I don't know what I would have done had I developed, such a sense of compassion and empathy during that time period for the people there, because I think it kind of might have put me in some dangerous situations that I shouldn't have been in. But instead, I always had my head on a swivel. I was extremely untrustful. I didn't believe a lot of times what, the interpreters were telling us through them. And so I would work harder to gather intelligence and support the war effort, or go on clearing operations, be outside the wire to where I could help, using our interpreters and our knowledge of the locals and the tribal warlords and everything else to gather kind of that intelligence to get a lot of the bad guys that were out there, because they were a dime a dozen, man. Like we had dudes that were on watch lists and everything that we would run into. So it was just kind of me becoming a new iteration of the person that I never thought I would become,
So let me ask you a very basic question, and it takes one word to answer it. When you get there, do you like the people?
I did. I thought it was cool at first. I was like, oh, this is, you go to like, people do safaris and other stuff. And like, that's the way I was thinking of it at first. It's like, oh, I'm going to eat the local food and I'm going to get this cultural experience. And then I'm going to come back home and tell all my friends about it. And it was cool at first. And then you start seeing some of the cultural practices. Like there's a thing there in Afghanistan called Bakhtabazi. If you ever want to be disgusted and haunted for the rest of your life, go watch I think it's 60 Minutes Frontline, one of those PBS special report. It's called The Dancing Boys of Afghanistan, but basically older men rape young boys there. They view women for procreation, and they'll dress little boys up and use them as playthings. And you saw it several times. And unfortunately, the United States military policy was, we will not interfere with cultural practices. And
so saying that, then going from you liked them when you got there and it's something to experience, do you hate them at the end?
Oh yeah.
I mean, full on
hate.
Okay.
And
now, do you think you still hate them?
No. I have, I love getting to meet Afghan special immigrant visa guys here, because I live in Colorado Springs now. And there's a guy who was an interpreter for a lot of the special forces groups, and he has a restaurant now that's like literally right next to my house. And so him and his buddies are all there. They're doing the cultural practices. They have the shin chai and everything else. And so I've talked to him. I've said hello to him in Pashtun. And he was just kind of stunned by that. And again, I think, in the ignorance of my youth, and not knowing how combat's going to go, you can very quickly, and like, I still know guys that just like hate everything about either Afghanistan or Iraq. And I think they've never let the walls down enough to see the good and the people that were good there. Whether it was an interpreter or a local that helped you out or something of that shape. But yeah, when I left, oh my gosh, my best friend got killed, and he replaced me, and I was like, I'm glad I wasn't there. I'm really glad I wasn't there because, like, I don't know what I would have done. So it's just, I came home very angry, just about, and I just didn't know who I was anymore, because I never thought I was the guy who was capable of such extreme violence.
So can we talk about Kyle a little bit since you brought him up?
Yeah. So Kyle, go ahead.
The only thing I want to say to that is I definitely want to talk about when you mention this story. I want you to talk about how you approach the subject of him being new in country and taking over for you. This episode brought to you by Max Belts. Guys, are you looking for a perfect accessory to wear every single day for every single scenario? Well, you've come to the right place. We all know that nothing stands up to wear and tear like a good leather belt. If you're looking for the toughest leather belt on earth, then you've come to the right place. Max Belts. They're handcrafted in the USA by veterans who are serious about their craft. And if you're looking for a belt that's tough enough for your active lifestyle and help support those who've given so much to our country, look no further than Max Belts. It's the toughest belt on the planet. It's a perfect solution for casual or dress wear and ideal for utility and firearm carry. It's the highest caliber of American craftsmanship, and it also positively impacts our military charity partners. Once again, Max Belts, you can't go wrong with them. I wear them every day. They're the toughest belt on earth. And you can find all of this and so much more at maxbelts.com.
Yeah, so Kyle was one of the guys. He was my best friend from my unit. We were super close. Like, he would come visit me while I was in college. He was one of those guys that was just, in fact, like, everybody loved him. And he was super funny, and he consistently just had a zest for life like nobody you'd ever seen. Like, he would, like, I remember we'd be rolling around in his car, and like he loved Tool. He loved the band Tool. He'd be rolling around listening to like the Anima album, and he'd just really get into it. And you just like roll down the windows and start honking at everybody and pointing at them and being like, "Yeah, you!" And then other people is like flipping off. And he was just he just had this larger than life personality and love life. And so we got along really well. And he was like my mom's like third kid. So he had his own key to my parents' house. And I mean, he was just a joker to his core. So every time he would come over, he had his tattoo on his ass. So he would moon my mom and like show her the tattoo. And my dad would just shake his head. He just thought it was ridiculous. But even while I was deployed, he would just go over and check in on my parents, make sure that they were doing good. So we were just close, man. Like we hung out and we did everything. And so he actually had been stop lost from leaving our unit because we were considered critical during that time period because they weren't doing a draft. And he had planned on staying in, but he wanted to transfer over to the Navy to be a journalist because he had been studying journalism and he had been covering like Miss America pageants and really wanted to be a writer later in life, which is kind of ironic and poetic and I guess in a really just distorted way for me. But so they said, nope, we need you. You're deploying. Sorry. So he was already past the time when he should have gotten out of the military. And so he came over and people from our unit replaced us. And when he first arrived, I had just been wounded in action. I had taken the brunt of another guy had taken the brunt of a 107 millimeter rocket that exploded near our position when the Taliban and Al Qaeda were attacking our base, like towards the end of my tour. And so I had this wrist was broken, had shrapnel, superficial shrapnel in my like arms and back. There was just, I could rub out and stuff like that. And some heavy pieces in my back plate. Then my back plate probably saved my life. But so I get wounded in action, end up saving one of my buddies, just from muscle memory, kind of cowardice, kind of, craziness. Like I got blown up twice in the process of like trying to get the medics, and finally went back in. And while I told the other intel guy that we were with, I was like, it's your turn to run out, man. I'm tired of getting blown up. And then I just worked to patch up my buddy. He ended up living, we ended up living. So that's kind of the stage. I'm in a cast when he gets there. And so immediately he knows shit's real. Like one of my best friends got injured while he was here. And so we go on this walk, and we're kind of over near Thunderdome, because I'm back in Kandahar, because I can't be on the front anymore. I'm dead weight. I'm just carting interpreters around for the last month. And I had the option to go home, but I was like, no, I'm going to stay. I need to be with my guys. So he shows up, and he's like, hey man, you walk with me, talk with me, kind of fill me in. And I was like, yeah, for sure. And he was like, how'd you do it? How did you like not go crazy from the fear and all this other stuff? And I remember, like, for me, what I did when I got over there, the way that I stopped being afraid was I would just wake up, and I was like, okay, I'm not dead yet. I'm still alive today. So I'm just going to keep breathing. But I might die today. So just kind of know that you're a dead man walking, and I took that approach. And it's so funny because years later, like in The Walking Dead, they talk about how that name became that because of, Rick's grandfather, who would literally in war tell him, wake up, you're not dead yet. Like, you're the walking dead. And so I just you kind of get to this point where you become okay with dying. And so I just kind of got to that point. And so I told him that, and just, it was a really calloused remark. And I just finally told him, I was like, look, man, I was so scared when I got over here, but I said, you have to make your peace with death. Like, I said, otherwise you're just not going to make it. And he was like, oh, okay, man. And instead, I really wish I would have just hugged him and joked and just told him, oh, don't worry about it, man. It gets easier or whatever, something trite, but I didn't. And something I still regret, because he got killed a week later. And of course I blamed myself for a real long time, and had to present his parents with his medals. It was pretty brutal. My mom and I still don't really talk about him together. We just don't do well with the subject when we're together. Before he died, he gave my mom this stupid fresco painting that's probably like, 6 inches by 4 inches, maybe the size of a postcard. It's this plaster fresco painting. It looks totally out of place, but it sits like in the middle of our house now. It's kind of like the ghost that haunts the house, in a way, because every time you look at it, you know that was Kyle. And he told my mom, he was like, you can never get rid of this. And she's like, and her whole thing was, she was like, as soon as he leaves, I'm totally dumping this in the trash. It's the worst, worst souvenir gift ever. And then when he died, now it's the one piece in my parents' house that looks completely out of place and yet totally in place. So, yeah.
So you have it all to do over again. What do you say?
I would have told him, hey man, I love you. You're going to do great. I'm really proud of you. You got this. And I think going with that, I would have been okay. Would have felt a lot better. And I've done a lot of counseling, EMDR. It's still hard, it doesn't take away the sting of his death. There's actually all these studies that show, like, when you lose a friend in combat, like, the grief is still pretty pronounced, even some 30 years later. So yeah,
So let me ask a question that it might sound kind of calloused on the surface, but I want you to really think about it.
Mm-hmm.
You change what you say to him, right? You say what you just said just now. Does it change anything in the overall picture?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't change what happened. It just changes. Everybody regrets what they wish they could have said to somebody in their last moments. Like, if you have a fight, like with your spouse, and then they get in a car accident and they die, you're like, oh, I wish we would have just kissed one another and said, hey, I love you. I'll see you when you get home, kind of thing. And instead, I think had I taken that other route, I wouldn't have had the regrets that I did.
The reason I ask you that is because I know, like I said, it sounds callous in the beginning, but I think that kind of changed your trajectory. The reason I think it changed your trajectory because after you come home, you volunteer to go back.
Mm-hmm.
You go so far as to volunteer to go back and lie to your spouse about you going back.
Yeah.
And I wonder, reading the book, if that had a lot to do with it. If that incident with him and you having the guilt over that pushed you in that direction. Because do you think that you had a death wish?
I do.
Okay.
I think some of it I thought was like revenge too. Like even that, but then as soon as I landed in Iraq, I was like, that's stupid. These aren't even the Afghans. And by that point, I was a team sergeant. But yeah, I think a lot of it was to prove I have what it takes. And if I die out here, then at least I'll die doing something noble. Because that was the biggest problem when I came home. I didn't know my place anymore. I graduated from college. I'd gotten married, and things bugged me about the world and society. Like I remembered like the inherent joy that I had just from like really simple things. Laughing with the guy, like sitting in a GP medium tent, freezing to death, and watching like DVDs of Family Guy, and some of the most purest moments of my life, and laughing, just with people that I would have done anything for. And then I come home, and it's like a million choices. It's like a million cereal choices, a million, and everything had changed. Like, I remember I got back home and Speaker Box and the Love Below by Outkast had come out while I was overseas. And I went in and I was like, oh my God, dude, have you guys heard this song? It's killer. It's called Hey Ya. And they're like, yeah, man, that song's old as shit. Where have you been? And that was the moment where I was like, and I wanted to be like, well, I've been in Afghanistan, but it was the moment that I realized like the world kept spinning without me. And nobody cares. Like, we're going to be in these wars for a while, and nobody cares like that I was there. They think it's cool maybe. But I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know who I am. I've got to figure this out. And I had done counseling around Kyle's death. My parents had to stage an intervention because I was just getting violently drunk all the time. I was kicking in my girlfriend who became my wife, like her door, and eventually I got the help that I needed to get me on the right track. But once I kind of got to that moment of clarity and sobriety, I was like, okay, well, if I can't be self-destructive here, maybe I can self-destruct over there.
Okay. So when you're angry here, do you have any idea why you're angry? I know that you said there's a ton of choices. There's, you can't get much mission, but is there anything specifically that you remember looking at it and you're like, what was it? I guess the question would be, you think, what was it all for?
I didn't have that yet. That was in Iraq. Like in Iraq, I literally remember one of my sergeants looking at me and just going, what the fuck are we doing here, man? And I didn't have an answer for him. And I was like, I don't know. But coming home, I can tell you exactly what it is. the mission, purpose, and camaraderie. Like I missed all of that. Like I went back to a world where, and I often talk to when I train corporations, entities, nonprofits about hiring veterans. I'll tell them, I said, it's really jarring for veterans to get out of the military, to come home from combat and then enter the corporate world, because in the military you're taught like leaders eat last, and we all know that sometimes that's not the case, but you're always going to see your generals serving a Thanksgiving turkey on Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever it is. They're always going to be the last in line. Like, and I was in a unit where it was emulated, where like the leaders did eat last, where all my team sergeants took care of me, made sure that I was taken care of, that I had the food that I needed, that I got the extra rest that I needed. And so I came out of that environment where I knew that somebody always had my back. Leaders were going to eat last. And then you go into an environment where leaders eat first. Nobody has your six. The bonds of brotherhood are not as strong. And so you start to struggle, and you go back to, it's like chasing the dragon. It's like, I know what gave me a sense of purpose, mission, and identity was being overseas. And if I can go back with the same guys, then why wouldn't I? And so that's what I did.
But let me ask you, when you say that, and you say you learned, you were emulated, First Sergeant Shanahan, Gonzo, there's a bunch of people that we can talk about that emulated that life. Over and over in the book, though, you talk about that you have to be pulled to the side and told, you're a good leader. Now act like one. You're this, you're that. So yeah. I'm wondering if you saw that and it was purpose, mission, all of that kind of stuff to get back to it. What was so hard about making that transition over to it then?
I think it was young. You know, there's a naivety to youth. And I said this, I used this word earlier, there's a hubris to it. And I think as you grow and as you mature in humility, you really begin to see the lessons that people tried to impart to you and the wisdom that they are trying to get you to understand. And as I've mentored young men, I've seen the same thing. You know, I've given them nuggets of what I've thought to be great wisdom, and they've ignored it, only to come back years later and be like, "Hey, man, like I literally met with a dude. I met with a dude that I met in his early 20s. Actually, he was I think he was maybe 19 or 20 when we first met, and he was in college." And his dad had died. It was dying of cancer, and then passed. And then we became friends. And you know, in Austin, and hung out all the time. And then eventually I moved away. And so when I was just back in Austin this summer, I was like, "Hey man, like let's meet up." And he just, you know, he's in his 30s now, and he goes, he was like, "Dude, I was hoping that you would reach out." He said, "I wanted to tell you this." He said, "I've come to the realization that everything you might have told me might actually be correct." And it was sound advice. And that was a joy for me to hear. And now I get to do the same thing with like Gonzo and Shanahan and all those guys. Like I may not have seen it at the time because I was young, but they were grooming me to become the leader that they wanted me to be.
So let's talk about First Sergeant Shanahan. Let's tell his story, the crazy story about him being in charge, leaving, and coming back.
Yeah, so Greg Shanahan, First Sergeant Greg Shanahan. So he was Superman to us. That dude, like,
Superman or One Nut.
Yeah, or
depending
old One
on
Nut.
the day.
Yeah, but he really was like. So when we would get in trouble, he would always go to bat for us, like because we were all just, you know, we're getting ready to go leave for Iraq, and so we're all wanting to party and do dumb stuff, and he would always take a bullet for us, man. Like he wanted to ensure that his troops were taken care of, and so he would go to bat. He would go toe to toe with some of the sergeant majors and some of the officers to protect us and to ensure that like we had the time and the rest that we needed. And so when we got overseas, he would go out on like combat patrols and operations. And so we were in Ramadi, Iraq in 2006 to 2007. We were doing, 15-month deployments at that point because it's the surge. And Ramadi is the most violent city on earth at that point. Like half of all daily attacks are coming out of just Ramadi alone. and half of all deaths that occur for the United States Marine Corps happen in Ramadi from 2006 to 2007. We were averaging, I think it was 50 attacks a day on coalition forces when we first got there. So, I mean, it's pretty gnarly. And like Route Michigan is constantly black. There's IEDs everywhere. You just getting pop shot by snipers or people that are pissed at you. Everything looks like an IED. I mean, the rules of engagement are just absolutely nuts. And so Shanahan goes on these ambushes and these missions with us to do support when we're short staffed. So, I mean, he's the guy's guy. Like, and we're all like, this is how you lead. And during this one ambush, and he's setting up an ambush, and he's climbing over this like fence thing. He ends up racking himself so hard he has to go to Charlie Med, to like the on base hospital. So they bring him in there. You know, his testicles are swollen. Come to find out, he has testicular cancer. So they fly him home. He has to undergo chemotherapy, and he's like, and before he leaves, you know, he's the buffer. He's the guy. He takes all the team sergeants, and he was like, hey man, this is on your shoulders now, but you guys know the right thing to do, and I expect you to do it. And we're like, all right, roger that, Top. And he's like, I'll be back to take you home. And we're all like, okay, whatever. Yeah, you're cancer. Walk in the park. Sure, we'll see you when we see you. You know, and sure enough, like a month, like I think it's maybe 2 months before we're about to come home, like he shows up one day, and we're like, holy shit, man. He ended up losing a testicle, but like, and of course, you know, like everybody, regardless of whether you're in the military or not, you always got to rag on the dude with one nut. So we did. And, you know, but we were all just in awe of a man whose character was like that, that he would literally just go through chemo, you know, struggle, and then ensure like, I got to take care of my troops. So I'm going to get back on that bird right after I get a clean bill of health and head back to a place where it can literally kill me to take my guys home. And so that's just the type of dude he was.
So let me ask you, when all this is going on and he leaves and he comes back later on, but you're in the most violent city, when do you lose your faith?
That had really kind of been in Afghanistan for me. Like I mentioned, like I love philosophy. I love reading theologians and philosophers. It's like my thing. Read a lot of old dead dudes. And then I like some of the new guys too, like Luke Ferry. He's a philosopher I really enjoy. Alistair McIntyre too. And, you know, but I like the classics too. Like you can go back as far as like Socrates and Aristotle for me, and Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics and stuff like that. And then from like the theological standpoint, you know, like C.S. Lewis and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and, you know, Henry Nouwen and Thomas Merton. Those are Catholic thinkers, and G.K. Chesterton. There's a lot of guys that I read, you know, I started to read while I was in Iraq. But Afghanistan, for me, I looked at the human condition. And the human condition was, okay. And, you know, South Park has made this joke over and over where it's like, you know, the world seems to be like this reality TV people where they took all the groups of people that naturally hate each other, and then it's just a giant reality TV for the rest of the universe to watch us all kill one another. And so for me, what I saw was like, it seems that the human condition is we continually fight. We go in these cycles of violence, war, and we kill each other over land or resources or slights or whatever it is. And, you know, at the time I had kind of taken this really secular humanist standpoint, which is, okay, according to science and everything else that I know, and the philosophers that I'm reading from, like, you know, Christopher Hitchens and whatnot, and science says that, you know, we as a species will cease to exist in about 3.5 billion years because of the entropic heat death of the sun. It'll turn into, you know, that red dwarf, and Earth, as we know it, will cease to exist unless we somehow figure out how to terraform other planets or life forms or whatnot. And it seemed to me that, you know, everybody talks about purpose in their life, and I think there's intrinsic and extrinsic purpose. Like intrinsic purpose is like where you derive purpose. Like, so for me, one of my purposes in life is to help other veterans, but that's not everybody. If you're Babe Ruth, it could be to hit 100 home runs. But extrinsic purpose, when you look at that, what is the purpose of Homo sapiens? It's a great question. Why are we here? Are we just a mishap in the evolutionary cycle of life, and then we eventually fail to exist as a species? And so when I started looking in at things that way, I was like, okay, we're really good at killing one another. We're really good at maiming one another. It doesn't seem to be any extrinsic purpose for why we do these things. It seems that we're kind of greedy and selfish. So why does anything that we do actually matter? Especially like if we take that even a step further and say that love is merely a chemical reaction in the brain to advance the species. So what is like rape or anything of that nature form? Does it form a better society? If so, why? And so I took this very philosophical and then moved into kind of this like nihilistic standpoint. And I was like, I don't like this. But I was kind of okay with that. And I had studied like a lot of the major world religions, from Buddhism to Islam to Christianity to, secular humanism. And everybody seemed to have like kind of this moral code. But for me, I was just like, oh man, like humans suck. And I don't know that I believe in anything, because the Christians seem to kill the Buddhists kill the Christians kill the Muslims kill the Christians, and I was just like, this is ridiculous. What are we doing here? And so I just kind of took this like nothing approach. I was like, nothing matters and I don't care. And that was really it for me in Afghanistan, because I saw the complexity, humanity, and the barbarity of the human condition and didn't know how to reconcile that. So I was just like, I'm out. I'll just believe whatever.
Okay, but you have a family back home that's still involved in the church. You have a wife that's Catholic back home. And there's a point in the book where you have a real problem and maybe throw a liquor bottle at a cross, and you really kind of come to the end of it with it.
Yeah.
But then in the next breath, you meet Father Rocheford and you start talking to him. But I wonder, when I'm in the book, you hate religion so bad and then almost immediately learn, well, maybe I was wrong. So let's talk about him. Let's talk about what he talked to you about and kind of his history, because he has a pretty amazing history too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I was in Ramadi, we were constantly on mission. So like I spent probably 300 days outside the wire, which looking back now, I'm like, that's nuts. I can't believe I did that, because I watched Masters of the Air and I was like, I wouldn't want to do 20 missions. That stuff's crazy. And then I was like, wait a minute, I did like over 300. That's pretty wild too. And so finally we get this break. And my wife had sent me some, bootleg liquor like everybody does when you're getting, where you're overseas. And so we're off mission for a couple days. I know we're not going to get called up or anything. And so I'm like, let's party. And so we invite, other guys from different Cat A's, and then we invite some of the PSYOP guys over too. So we have this big old, kind of shindig. We're just getting plastered, and I'm like super wasted by the end, because I haven't drank in forever, because I can't. Our hooch is like, the way that we have it is this plywood building. And then there's these HESCO barriers, blast barriers, right behind it. And then on the other side of that HESCO barrier is the chapel. And I'm out on the back porch, like peeing on this HESCO barrier, and I have the door open. I'm just looking at this little, cross steeple. And I'm just mad, because at this point I'm like questioning what I'm doing in the Iraq war. I'm like, I don't know what we're doing here. Are we bringing these people democracy, or are we just killing them? Like, what are we doing? Like, and I kept seeing like all these senators like fly in and check on their Kellogg Brown and Root investments. Like there was a VIP landing pad just for these, and they would come in and like try and do that. Like it was all just smoke and mirrors. They'd be like, oh, let's do a photo op with the troops. And then you'd see them tour the KBR facilities. And I was like, all these idiots are checking their investments. Like, what the hell? And I was like, I don't know that I believe in the war effort, but I didn't want to say that. But like a lot of us started to have our doubts, especially with just so many people dying in that area. And I'm mad. And I'm like, and I don't know who to blame. So I have this empty Sailor Jerry liquor bottle, and I'm just like, fuck this. And like try and hit that steeple. I'm not even getting anywhere close. Like, so it just like goes over the Hesco Barrens, clunk, behind the chapel. And so the next day I have to go grab it and scrape the thing off because you don't want any evidence coming back to you. And I'm walking by, and I'm just like, I wonder what the inside of this looks like. I wonder if it's like from my childhood or, like the Catholic mass back home. So I walk in, and it's where like all the Protestant chaplains were and the one lone Catholic priest in the area. So it was like this hodgepodge of weird, Protestant and Catholic iconography. So you didn't know if like the Pope was in charge or Martin Luther was. So it was very strange. And so I kind of walk in, and just out of curiosity, and the next thing I know, I hear this voice that says, "Can I help you, my child?" And I like kind of whirl. I'm about to pull my rifle up, and it's this chaplain in Marine Corps fatigues, and he's got the little cross above his name, Rocheford, and we just start having a conversation, and he's like kind of blocking my way to get out. And he's just asking some probing questions like, what brings you in here today? And I'm like, I was just curious, I was walking by, haven't been in a long time. And, I explained that my wife is Catholic, and, I grew up Protestant. And he's like, what do you think about now? And I was like, I don't know. I was like, I'd like to believe there's something bigger. I just don't know. So it come to find out. So like Dennis is a Vietnam vet, like, infantry grunt in Vietnam, who out of 150 men that went in during the Tet Offensive, he was one of 6 in his platoon to live. And I remember, like, as we were meeting and stuff, like, I would just go in because I thought he was a cool dude. I was like, I want to get to know this guy. He's got a hell of a story, and he had been wounded in action, so we were both kind of similar. But he was a lifelong alcoholic, like on and off the wagon. And he wasn't like super Catholic. He actually would read like Protestant literature and stuff. So it made everything just like a little bit more palatable for me. So I was like, you know what, I should get confirmed while I'm here. It'll help out my marriage. And so I go through the confirmation process and everything. And I'm still thinking like, I'll just do it, to make things better at home. But I did it also just because I really like Dennis, and he made me think critically about some things, that I had been thinking about, like the nihilistic points of life. And then, he gives me his Bible because he's getting ready to leave because his tour of duty is ending. But I mean, that dude had it rough. He was the only priest in all of Al Anbar. So he was literally doing funerals like almost every day, last rites and all that stuff. And this dude had been in since Nam, seeing the worst of it. And so the sad part to it is like years later after I got home, he was really the guy that planted like seeds of faith and had me start exploring faith once more. And I can credit everything to him for that very reason. And I went out and I found like, his Bible and everything that I kept in this foot locker. And, behind me, you can see my shadow box. But back in the day, I refused to talk about anything. I wouldn't talk about war. I wouldn't talk about like what I had been through. I just got busy with my job and living. And it for me now, as much as I talk about it, it's kind of wild that I never once brought it up. In fact, like I had friends who were literally like, hey man, I know you served overseas. I know nothing. Like, you never talk about it. And I was like, oh yeah. So I kept all my stuff in a Foot Locker out in the garage, like medals, awards, all military memorabilia, my old uniforms, everything. Because it was just like, oh, this is a piece of me that we're not going to unlock. It belongs out in the garage and it's going to stay there. And so, I had talked to my wife. I had gotten divorced and remarried, and she had said, like, you always talk about this priest that like planted these seeds of faith in you. How come you haven't reached out to him? And I was like, yeah, it's a good question. You told me I should. So one day I'm home and I go and I pull his old Bible out, and he'd given me a card to his parish up in Massachusetts, Rhode Island area. And I call the number, and this like cheery woman answers on the other line. And I said, hey, my name's like Staff Sergeant Benjamin Sledge. I was overseas with Father Rocheford. He was instrumental in my faith journey. I said, I promised I would call him, and I never did. And I said, I was wondering if I could speak with him. And there's kind of some silence on, and the woman goes, I am so sorry. She said, he passed some time ago. And I was like, oh, really? Like, how did he pass? And at first, I thought he drank himself maybe to death or something, or he had like liver disease or heart disease from something. He's older. He was in Vietnam. He could have had a lot of stuff. And she just and that was my initial thought. And she goes, it's best if we remember the departed as they were. And if you're Catholic, you know what that means. That means like somebody took their life and they're not getting into the pearly gates, because like that's their dogma and stuff. And so I grit my teeth and I'm like, tell me how he died. And she just goes, suicide. So I found out like prior to him dying, he had fallen off the wagon again. He was drinking again. And one morning in 2009, he drove out from his home in Narragansett, parked his car in the middle of a bridge, walked over to the side, stared for like witnesses say like 3 seconds, and then jumped over the side and was pronounced dead on the scene. So, yeah.
With him being so instrumental in your faith walk and I'm sure others, you said that he fell off the wagon, but what do you think happened? You talked to this guy a lot over there. You got to know him. So in your best, what do you think happened?
Oh, I think his demons got up with him. Here's the easiest way. Dennis took on everybody else's problems. Nobody ever once asked him, hey, Dennis, how are you doing? Like, what's going on? Are you handling this stuff well? All the death and destruction and everything else that you've seen, are you doing counseling? Like, how are you feeling? Like, I don't think he had anybody. And that's a very lonely road to walk. And when you've walked it long enough and had it whittled down at you, like, it'll take you out. Like, one of the biggest things that I do now is I ensure that I'm living in community and talking about where, I'm falling short and where, my challenge points are, because we've all got blind spots. And the last thing that I want is just to take on everybody else's burdens, because like me working with vets and everything now and dealing with guys that have been through the ringer, you hear those dark stories and you've been through them too. And so you remember, if you personalize everybody else's like trauma and their hardships, that's a lot to take on. And when you're doing as many funerals as he did and nobody's checking in with you and everybody thinks like, you're strong, you got this, like, it's a slippery slope. And so really that's, for me, I think it's as simple as that.
I want to go back to you over in the Middle East. There's one more thing that happened that I think has set the tone for the rest of your life. You made a phone call one night, and you were going to call your wife at the time, now ex-wife, and talk to her. And something that happens, I think, a lot more often than we talk about, or a lot more often than we want to think happens. So if we can talk about you calling your wife, it already was a little bit rocky. You had been gone. She had found out that you actually volunteered and all of those kind of things. You had told her before you left, but I'm sure that didn't set the tone for you leaving. Then you're outside the wire over 300 days. Let's talk about how that relationship was going, how that phone call kind of changed the whole trajectory of what you were doing.
Yeah. So I call home one evening, and she says she's leaving. It was, and like for me, it was just like totally out of the blue. It was just this wild gut punch that I was like, wait, what? And like, I think like a month and a half, 2 months prior, she was like, hey, I'm getting into counseling. And I was like, okay, like I know things are tough. Like I've been gone for forever. So like, I get it, this will probably be a good thing. It'll help our marriage kind of thing. And then like, she's like, yeah, my counselor thinks I should leave you. And I was like, who the F is your counselor? Like, what kind of trash advice is this? And I'm just going off like, and it's just out of nowhere. But we had always had, like, our relationship had always been very tumultuous. Like, I was very much of the opinion, like, oh, people are in these relationships to make you happy, which is a very self-centered and selfish way of looking at a marriage as opposed to like a partnership. So I was always looking for her to fill my needs, and she was always looking to me to fill my needs. And then like we just did not mesh well together. Our friends knew we just had this like toxic relationship. We would fight and make up and fight and make up and fight and make up. Like it was just a constant cycle of shenanigans, and everybody could see it. My brother tried to warn me repeatedly, like everybody did, and I was like, no, but I love her, yay, like kind of thing. And honestly, looking back now and after all my years of counseling and whatnot, I felt like I owed her because she stuck beside me when I was in Afghanistan and came home crazy. And I should have just cut off the relationship because we had a couple moments where we were like split up and then got back together. And I think when you do the work and you look back, like it takes two to tango. And even though she was the one that left, like in the middle of my deployment, which totally sucks, I played a hand in that. I was really selfish. I made everything about me, and and I get why she left. So it makes sense to me these days and now, but at the moment, man, I hang up the phone after like trying to convince her for like 30 minutes not to leave. And then the reality sits in and I'm in our tactical operations center and I start chunking chairs. It's super late at night, so nobody's in there. And then I walk outside, and that's when like the grief finally hits me. I start crying, and have fallen down next to this like giant green generator because I didn't want people to hear me crying. And so I figured that'll drown out the noise. And I'm just watching my tears fall into that like moon dust that they have over there. It's like silt, and it's just gobbling it up. And I remember having the thought, like, this place eats lives in more ways than one. And all of a sudden, like, Shanahan shows up, and he's like, Sledge, are you okay, man? And I just start crying, and I'm like, she's leaving. She's really leaving. And he's like, what? Tell me, like, what's going on? And finally, I'm able to get it out through sobs and gasps and stuff. And he just hugs me and puts me in his chest, and I'll never forget it. He says, hey, man, you're not alone, and we'll get through this together. And, I'm like, yeah. I was like, Top, you got to send me back home. You got to send me back home. And finally he sits me down. He's like, Sledge, if we sent every guy whose spouse had left them or cheated on them or took his money and run off back home, he said, we wouldn't have anybody to fight this war. And you know that. And I was like, shit, I'm stuck here. And I start slipping, man. I cause my head's not in the right spot. And one of my teammates, Casey Wagner, he pulls me aside one day and he's like, hey, man, we need to talk. And I'm like, all right, what's up? And he's like, you're slipping on missions. We're in our last 90-day windows. And so for people in the military, they know, and for the civilians out there listening, like the first 90 days are the most dangerous. That's when most people get killed, in the last 90 days, because you get complacent and you're like, I'm going home. No big deal. So he's like, hey man, you're slipping on missions. And I'm like, I'm I go to, I'll be like, that's not true. And he's like, just holds up his hand and he's like, look, man, you know it and I know it. Your wife left you. And I was like, all right. And he was like, here's the deal, man. He's like, you know that we're all really sorry that this has happened, man. Like, you know that we're here for you and we love you and we got your back and everything. He's like, but if you don't pull it together, man, he's like, you're going to get us freaking killed. And he's like, and I can't have that. And he's like, so are you in or are you out? And I was like, all right, I'm in. I got to get my head back. So the last 90 days in country, or last 2 months, I think it was, I'm just having to, like, it's like that scene from Talladega Nights where he's like, take all that just shove it all right down, never bring it up again, And I was able to make it through the deployment, and we got hit like one last time. Like my lieutenant got the front of his Humvee blown off. And after that, we're like, all right, we're done. We're not doing missions anymore. This is out. We was like, no, we're tapped out. We're off missions for the rest of the tour. So like the last month, we were just like, no, we're not going outside the wire anymore. We're done. Cause like I couldn't keep my head straight. He had gotten blown, our lieutenant had gotten blown up. Everybody else is frazzled. So yeah. And then I'm dealing with this divorce and trying to figure that out. And it from what I can tell, like based on pictures, it already looks like she's moved on, cause I'm stalking Facebook and MySpace. Cause it was a thing back then. I've already been removed from the top 10 friends, on MySpace. And I'm like, yep, it's over. So, and then when I get home, it's like super bad. She won't even pick me up from the airport. So, yeah.
So let me ask you, you said now that you look back on it, it was your fault. Well, partly your fault. I'm not going to say, your whole fault. Yeah. Let me clarify that. How hard a pill is that to swallow?
It was hard at first. Like when I got involved in the church that I was at, and I met some guys who really took an interest in my life. They really talked about, practicing forgiveness. And I was literally like, nah, fuck that bitch. Like, I'm not going to do that. It was literally what I was thinking. But then I really began to, I would go to work and I remember like, they were just like, just try saying it out loud. Like, and I like through clenched teeth, I'd be like, I forgive you. And then I'd say it a little bit louder and then I'd punch my steering wheel for like 20 seconds and then drive off after the, people are staring at me at the light. But I ended up getting into doing some divorce counseling and because like, I was like, I've been done wrong, this person's evil, and I would tell everybody, at the time, like, I'd be like, oh yeah, I was done dirty by my wife. Cause I wanted sympathy, and like everybody hates the girl who like left her spouse overseas. So it was an easy rock to throw. Much harder is when, it's like that, there's that famous story where like the woman's caught in adultery and Jesus is bending down, writing in the sand. And he's like, hey, those of you that haven't jacked up, cast the first stone, man. And so when I got into like divorce counseling, like I began to see a lot of my shortcomings and flaws, like my eyes opened to that. And I was like, oh man, I think I did some bad stuff that pushed her away. And then I was like, I think I was a shitty husband. And I was like, oh God. And the more that it kind of came about, you feel pretty crappy at first. And so eventually when I was doing, my 12-step work, I went and made amends with her. And I was like, I am sorry that, I was a poor excuse for a husband, that I was always running off to play war, that I was never home. Like out of the 4 years we were together, I was home for like a year and 9 months. So I never really had time to actually be a husband, and told her, I made things about me, and I hope that you can forgive me one day, So it was really freeing in that respect. But when you first kind of come to that epiphany, you're like, I'm not as awesome as I think I was. And the great part about it too once you take that hard pill or that hard to swallow pill, if you're willing to do the work, it'll make you better for your next relationship. And that's what I realized. I was like, if I don't want the same track record playing out in my relationships where I'm a constant source of dysfunction, then I've got to heal some things in me right now so that I can be the type of man that my future spouse or future girlfriend is actually going to want.
Well, and when you come back, it's let's talk about that hard pill for a minute. You come back to Houston, no job, no wife, nothing really on the horizon. You got an empty house. It's a new house that you bought that is doing you no good. And your friend calls you and brings you down to Austin, which once again changes the trajectory of your life.
It does.
You get involved in a church there again. And this is what I mean at the beginning of this conversation, where I say you were almost like an alcoholic on and off the wagon. You left religion, then you came back to it a little bit, and then you left it again, and then you kind of came back to it again. What was it about now? Are you just maturing? Are you just figuring out like, hey, I'm maybe not as great as I thought I was? What is it that's really driving you to work finally, instead of putting on a mask, work on yourself?
Really, it was my friend Josh. He was the guy that was the first person to take compassion and empathy on me, and not be weirded out by like my stories from war. Like, because civilians are really bad about that. Like, I've done a couple podcasts where I've told some stories, and like you can distinctly tell the difference between the civilian and soldier divide. Whereas like there's these really grotesque, and like they're like, how could you possibly do something like that? That's evil or whatever. And like I know a lot of guys who've done far worse or done the equivalent or even a little bit less, because nobody knows how they're going to respond in combat. But the thing that I've realized is like the reason why a lot of veterans do not tell war stories is simply because we can read the body language of the people around us. Like we can see what the civilians think, and they're trying to be polite, and they're like, oh, tell me about war and whatnot. But when you start talking about people's heads exploding or killing dogs or whatever it is, like it shuts them down because they're not used to that. And they either do that fake smile, the plastered one, and they're like, or they're like kind of looking for escapes or exits. And what it communicates to a veteran is you're a monster. And so we refuse to tell those stories. We won't have any part of it because our stories are not safe with them. And so I've even still to this day, like I've gotten blown up by the civilian populace because, of stories that I've told. And I'm like, this is why we don't tell you, is because of your response right there. And then you wonder why we go home and we kill ourselves, is because you heap shame and guilt on us, thinking you would have not been or done the same thing had you been in that situation and you were never there. So you don't even know how you'd respond. And so I remember I took a chance with Josh, and I was just telling him a few things. I'm like, we're going to find out if this dude's a real Christian, if he's just actually going to accept me or not. And I just remember he leaned across the table and was like, hey man, it sounds like you've had a really rough go this past couple of years. I know that hasn't been easy, but I'm here if you ever want to talk about it, kind of thing. And I was like, oh wow, that was dope. Like he didn't run. And so from there, I found out about Josh's life. Like his parents were like hoarders, like so bad that like the TV show Hoarders wanted to do a special on them. Like they had like cats all in the house. When one would die, his dad would just like throw a newspaper over it. Constantly smelled like urine. Like, I mean, it's just bad environment. And so like he became like an extreme minimalist to like where he only owned like 5 shirts and 3 pairs of pants, kind of thing. And it was always ashamed of his upbringing. And his dad was an alcoholic. He had a really tumultuous relationship with both of his parents and never got to resolve that. And his dad died, and then his mom died like 3 months later. And so he just been through the ringer. And one day we're having lunch, and he's like, hey man, I just want to let you know I'm in counseling. And he was like, if I act weird or I'm a dick to you or whatever it is, like, this is why. And just kind of gave me his background and his story. And I was like, oh my God, dude, I didn't know that. Like, that's crazy, And then
looking for an exit.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, I wasn't. I was fascinated.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah. That's crazy. Can I get out of here now?
Yeah. Whoa, hey, look at the time.
Yeah. And so it really freed me up to just start talking about, my life and where I was hurt, where I was angry, where I wasn't sure about God and other stuff. And I just had him and another guy named Andy really just walk with me through that, and they just became guiding lights in my life. And I was like, okay, if this is like what the Christian faith is actually supposed to look like, and these people emulate compassion and empathy, and yet they were like very strong male role models too at the same time, because like everything else that I had seen, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a religion for wieners, and out of that, I just really began to read a lot more, explore a lot more. And I liked thinkers like C.S. Lewis because, he was a combat wounded veteran who fought in the Somme during World War I. And I was like, all right, man, this dude knows what's up. He's
tried to re-enlist for World War II.
Yep. Tried to re-enlist for World War II. I mean, so I was just like, okay, there are people out there that have good and compelling reasons for why they believe the faith that they do. And so I just began to explore, and then eventually I met with like the senior pastor at our church, a guy named John Burke, who's still an extremely close friend of mine, guiding light in my life. And, I call and ask questions from him all the time. And he's, even though he was popular, like he always made time for people. And out of that, I really begin to see like a lot of people co-opt, like I was talking about earlier, like the Christian faith, because it's like something to do, or I don't know, I guess they want to feel better about themselves or whatnot. And for me, what I saw was like, okay, there's a way that can be countercultural to where I can bless those that persecute me. I can endure suffering and find meaning out of it. And I can encourage and spur other people on towards thinking about bigger picture stuff. Like, what is our purpose? And it goes back to, that question I had all along. What is our purpose as human beings? Like, why do we keep doing the things that we do? Why is there, greed and violence and power struggles in the human heart? And for me, I found that after studying for years, and reading through secular humanists all the way to Christian thinkers, that Christianity for me was not only like intellectually stimulating, it was emotionally satisfying. And so I finally kind of landed the plane there and have been there ever since.
So let's talk about now and how we kind of wrap this up. You're a father now, a husband, your life, you're an award-winning journalist now, or a writer, I guess you would say. Let's talk specifically about the book with all of these things that you've learned from your past, like we talked about, where you learned to kind of say that it was on you too. Writing this book, the joy and the pain from it. Let's talk about what helped you and what hurt you. And then I have one final question for you.
The book helped and hurt at the same time. So like writing it was really cathartic. And I'm still, there's a lot of stories that I haven't told yet that deal with like other guys that I was with. I'm working on a piece right now that I'm going to be pitching to the Atlantic. And it tells the story of some of the guys that were not in the book, but that were there with me at the same time. And you go back through that stuff and it's painful, man. Like, one of my friends was telling me, like, it was during one of the operations that we were all on. And I was like, hey man, I know we're at this part of the city and you're over here. Like, tell me about like what you were going through. He's like, yeah, dude, this dude's leg's blown off. I got my arm, my hand up there trying to pinch off this femoral artery because he's like ballooning up, and I'm trying to ratchet down this, and it's stuff like that where you're just like, oh man, we were really in that. We were really doing stuff like that. And then people really died, and like there was blood and guts and viscera. And you think about it, like some of the stuff you've seen, and your brain kind of tries to play a trick on you to where you're like, that didn't really happen. That wasn't real. Like you're just making all this stuff up. And then you get around guys that you were overseas with, and you realize it's like that scene in Star Wars where it's like, it's true. All of it's true, you know? And you're like, man, we really lived through this. And so when I was writing the book, I was conducting a lot of interviews with the guys from my unit, people that I'd served overseas with. You know, I'm going over old maps. I'm talking to subject matter experts, and I'm like, and then I'm writing my own experience in the process. And I'm like, it's finally getting out there for the world to see. And then sometimes it would just hit me like a ton of bricks, like, and I'd be, you know, inconsolable, crying. I remember I was just finished up the first draft when the fall of Afghanistan happened. And I was just up wandering my house for like all hours of the night, you know? And it was weird because I remember like when Ramadi fell to like ISIS in like 2015, I was like, whatever, screw this. But then like once we had wrapped up Iraq and then Afghanistan, and we had such a horrible withdrawal and like nobody was held accountable for that disaster, I was just like, it's over. It's finally over. And so I had to go back and, you know, kind of edit sections towards there at the end to put in the Afghanistan withdrawal. And it was it was the beautiful awful is what I would call it.
So the final question would be, writing this book, we've talked about putting a mask on, being a chameleon, this whole conversation, doing whatever you needed to do. Do you think you finally reached the point writing this book that it made you a better person? And I don't mean a better person to the world and stuff like that. Can you finally look at yourself in the mirror and go, I like who I am?
Yeah, I truly enjoy who I am. And I think that process started long before the book began. I really think it started in 2016 to where I finally was able to reconcile all my identities into the person who I am. Like, I'm the husband, I'm the father, I'm the veteran, I'm the artist, I'm the creative guy, I'm the metalhead, you know? And I had started putting those pieces of my life together. And what I realized is, like, for most of my life, I like to play the coward, you know? And I think everybody does. Everybody has that. And it's why I named my book this. And then I'll get back to your question. I named my book Where Cowards Go to Die because I inherently realized that in order for you to become the person that you want to be in this life and to experience the growth that needs to happen, there are areas of your life that you're self-protective over. There's areas that you're not dealing with. And if you don't deal with those things, then you're going to die as a coward because you never had the fortitude to actually face down those demons and deal with them. On the opposite end of the coin is the minute you start putting in the work, like, it's going to feel like part of you's died because you're actively working to kill that cowardice inside the human heart, inside you, that wants you to stay stuck and protective, dwelling on the past as opposed to what can be. And for me, I realized, like, either way in life, a coward dies. You know, you're either going to die as a coward or you're going to have to put the coward to death. And so in 2016, I wrote an article for Medium about my time overseas. And it was the first time I'd written something really on the topic. The rest of the time I was writing about mental health and anxiety and depression because I was working for a nonprofit in the mental health realm. And that stuff had blown up. It had done really well. But all of a sudden, this article goes stupid viral because I learned about the term moral injury, which is the psychological damage that occurs when you have to do things that violate your sense of right and wrong, which is a lot of stuff you do in war, watching your friends die if you have to shoot a woman or child, watching innocents suffer, having to make choices that you normally wouldn't think that you were capable of. Because you're in a wartime scenario, it's totally different. And so it's much different from PTSD because it's not a traumatic stressor like, hearing fireworks or whatnot. It's like a bruise on the soul where you feel shame and guilt because of what you've done. And so I wrote this article about, like, how I had experienced some of that, and how some of the guys that I knew, even from church that were veterans, had experienced that as well. And we just didn't talk about our stories because there's just a lot of hard things to bring up and to discuss. And I told this story about the Flower Girl, which is a little girl that I almost shot. It's in the book, so I'm not going to tell the story because it's a long one. But if you pick up the book, you'll hear about it. She was like 8 years old. So I tell this story, and people resonate with it, and it just goes stupid viral, like real stupid viral. And one of my other teammates from Iraq had started a little WordPress blog where he was writing stuff down about his experiences overseas and embedding the maps. And it was kind of more like I would say, a sit rep, a situation report about like stuff, but he would add his personal anecdotes in. And I just thought that was really brave of him to do. And I asked him, hey man, why are you doing that? And he's like, I want my kids to know like what happened to me. If something should ever happen to me, I was like, they probably wonder why I am the way that I am sometimes. And I want them to have a record of what I've been through. And I was like, that's good. That's brave, man. I respect that. And it gave me the courage to write that article. Article goes stupid viral. I'm just like, oh God, like SOFREP, like everybody's picking it up. Like it has like 1 million views. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, what is going on? I was like, I did not mean for this to happen. Like, cause I had just thrown it out in the ether thinking whatever. And then, so a couple of weeks go by and I'm back to, my writing thing, writing about personal growth and, mental resilience and blah, 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 whatever. And I kind of hit writer's block and I go to my editor at Medium, this chick named Steph, and I say, hey, what do you guys want me to write on? She said, oh man, we love your stuff on war. And like Medium's pretty left-leaning publication. I was like, what? And she said, yeah, we love it, man. She's like, the storytelling, she's like, it's great. We need to hear these stories. I was like, oh, I don't write about that. I don't write about that stuff. I was like, I don't talk about it. And she goes, why? And I said, just because we don't talk about it. That's my stuff to deal with. And she said, well, that's a travesty. And I was like, how so? How's this a travesty? And she said, you do realize you're like the smallest minority in the United States, right? Like veterans are, especially combat veterans. She goes, you recognize that, right? She's like, even less than like American Inuit. And I was like, no. And she's like, yeah, it's like less than 1% of you has served. And she goes, and even less than that percentage has actually seen combat. And she goes, look, we're going to lose all these stories to the annals of history because you guys won't talk about it. She goes, we need to learn from you guys. And she said, when you stay silent, she said, these stories just go by the wayside, the stories of your bravery, the stories of your cowardice, the stories of the humanity, the complexity and the barbarity that we all need so that we grow as human beings. And she's like, and it's a travesty you won't talk about it. And I was like, oh man, okay. So she gave me a different perspective. I was like, all right, I think I'm going to start writing about this. I think I'm going to start talking about this. And I did. And the more that I wrote about war and the more that I talked about it, like people loved it. And they wanted to know more. They wanted to hear more. And finally, and to bring this full circle, I felt like I was able to take that part of me that I was so self-protective over and then ingratiate it with the rest of me to become a wholehearted human being. So.
Well, so what's next on the horizon for you?
Fantasy trilogies, man. I am a giant like dork when it comes to that stuff. I love fiction. Like like when I got my book deal, initially when I signed with my agent, I was like, look, I want to write fantasy. And she was like, people know you for war. You should probably write that first. And I was like, but I want to write fit. And I had already had like a portion of a manuscript ready. And she's like, this is great. She's like, but you need to write your war one first. And so I'm in the process of writing a fantasy trilogy right now. It's a little bit different because you have to complete the entire manuscript before you can sell it to a publisher. So it's different than writing nonfiction. And then I've been ghostwriting for people. I have articles that I want to pitch to different major publications, to continue to write, and one of the ones that I'm hoping that the publications pick up is I think we've done a really poor job of whitewashing the Iraq and Afghan wars, because these stories aren't getting told. The stories that are getting told, and like, this is not a knock, these dudes are my buddies, is like, it's like I'm a Navy SEAL and I had this giant battle, and those are cool stories. They are. It's like you shot Osama bin Laden, or you're a lone survivor, or you wake up at 4 a.m. and mainline protein and you're an ultra marathon runner. That's great. Those are all good things. But what about like your average grunt who's there in the day in and day out? What does that look like? We look at like the history of our grandfathers, and it's the humanity behind Band of Brothers, or the Pacific, or Masters of the Air, or We Were Soldiers, or the things they carried, or Helmet from My Pillow, that really connects with us. And so out of that, I think there's a lot more stories that deserve to be told about the Iraq and Afghan wars, as opposed to just one giant battle. I want people to see the good, the bad, the ugly, and come to terms with that and what they asked of us for the longest running wars in U.S. history. So yeah, that's what I'm working on.
All right, where can people find you? And let's talk social media, anywhere that they can look to pick up the book. Of course, it'll be on our website and stuff where they can link in, but let's talk about your website and social media where they can find you.
Sure. I tell everybody this: you can literally Google my name and everything that pops up is me. You can Google Ben Sledge. You can Google Benjamin Sledge. My website is benjaminsledge.com. I'm on like Instagram, TikToks, all the shenanigans. So you can find me there. And then you can pick my book up. Amazon's obviously the easiest. They hired an award-winning voice actor who's done like Star Wars and Marvel to do the voice, and he does a fantastic job. As Bradford Hastings did such a great job on narrating my book. So if you like to listen in the car, I can
confirm that.
Yeah. If you like to listen, it's a good one. If you want the copies, Amazon has it. Every major bookstore has it. Barnes and Noble. You can pick it up there. They carry it in stock. And then also at the same time, if you want an autographed version, I sell those on my website. So just go to benjaminsledge.com and I'll be happy to write you a personal note. I write personal notes in all of them. I don't just autograph them. You get a little note personal from me because I want to make it special for you.
Man, awesome story. Guys, this is a fantastic book. Fantastic book. This guy lays it all out there on the line, and what is so great about it is you use words that a lot of people are scared to use about themselves, and especially in a public setting. You guys need to pick this book up, Where Cowards Go to Die. Do you know where you can find Benjamin? Let's talk about where you can find me. As always, you can find me on Facebook at the DTD Podcast. You can find me on Instagram at the DTD_podcast. And you can find me on YouTube, where all these conversations, they're in video form, at the DTD Podcast, Dynamic Tales Delivered. But your one-stop shop, DTDpodcast.net. It's got audio, video, pictures of Benjamin will be on his own page, all the links to pick up his book, and anywhere that you would need to talk to him or find out some more about him. Make sure that you go check that out, dtdpodcast.net. As always, be a friend, tell a friend. If you like what we're doing here and telling these stories, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you tell your friends to subscribe. You can find us on all podcast outlets, and you can find us on YouTube, where, once again, these are in video form. Also, make sure you stop by the guys that make this show happen. TridentCoffee.com, and if you put in DTD15, that's DTD15, you get 15% off your order. These guys are the masters in cold brew, and it is an amazing product that you need to check out. Also, my buddy over at Max Belts, maxbelts.com. Make sure you get the toughest leather belt on earth. And one of our newest people coming in, hatchetbrewing.com. Greg Walker, we know him as a former Special Forces officer, and now he has a brewing company in North Carolina. It is absolutely amazing. Go check out all the swag they have over there and look at what they're doing at the brewery. Guys, that's going to be it for this week. Thank you so much, Benjamin. It was an honor that you were on the show. A pleasure to meet you. That's going to be it, guys. That's Benjamin. I'm DJ. This has been the show. We'll catch you guys later. See ya.